The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar. We will get started on time in 1 minute. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar entitled Cover Crop Seeding Options, What You Need to Know. My name is Anna Goodjohnsdottir, and I'm the project coordinator at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management, who is hosting the webinar this morning. We are joined today by my colleague, Dr. Thomas Green, president and co-founder of the IPM Institute, who will provide a brief introduction. I'm also pleased to welcome our guest speakers. Today we'll hear from Dr. Heidi Johnson, Dane County Crops and Soils Educator for the University of Wisconsin Extension, and Daniel Smith, Outreach Specialist at University of Wisconsin-Madison. At the end of their presentations, we will use the remaining time for Q&A. Before we begin, I wanted to share some brief logistics. You will remain muted as an audience member during the presentations, but please make use of the question box on your screen to type questions for Heidi and Dan. I will moderate the questions at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later on partnershipfarm.org. By attending the webinar today, you will be eligible for 1.5 CCA continuing education units, 1 for crop management, and 0.5 for soil and water management. You must be present for the entire webinar to receive those points. If you're watching this webinar live, you will receive an email in the next few hours with the webinar recording and a link to submit survey evaluations. A link will be provided at the end of this webinar to submit CCA credentials to earn points if you have not already done so. If you are watching this on demand at a later date, please be sure to watch through the Citrix platform and not YouTube to receive credit. A link to register on Citrix will be provided in the text below the YouTube video recording, or it will be emailed to you if you've already registered for this webinar. You are provided instructions at the end of this presentation to submit your credentials. And now with those logistics taken care of, I will turn it over to Dr. Thomas Green. Okay.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Looks like we've got close to 100 people participating. So the Partnership for Ag Resource Management is one of the many projects here at our nonprofit IPM Institute, each focused on using the power of the marketplace to improve sustainability. Our team of 20 is currently working to increase adoption of best practices and improve outcomes in health, environment, and economics, all key elements of sustainability. We write regularly on IPM and other topics for Crops and Soils magazine. Our article on the revised worker protection standards is in the most recent issue. But we also work with pest control companies, hospitals, schools, and other facilities and communities, and with food companies and farmers around the world to improve practices and performance, and to communicate those benefits to buyers and the public. Our objective with the Partnership for Ag Resource Management include identifying revenue opportunities for ag retailers that help keep our valuable ag resources on cropland, help promote those products and services, and then track and report sales and estimated reductions in losses of nutrients and other inputs. Next slide. So we focus primarily on phosphorus losses to date. The two photos in the upper right show what happens when too much phosphorus gets in the water, feeding blooms of harmful algae which close beaches to swimming, make fishing a challenge, and have also shut down public water supplies. The graph on the left shows NOAA annual data on algal bloom severity since 2002 with an estimate for 2017. So after phosphorus loadings declined sharply in the mid-80s with the advent of reduced tillage, they've increased. And as a result, we've experienced more frequent and severe algal blooms. The satellite image of Lake Erie shows a plume of sediment from the mouth of the Maumee River on the left-hand side, extending down to the Sandusky Bay with additional plumes coming from smaller rivers. This picture was taken in May of this year. Because of the timing of the phosphorus runoff and losses through tile drains and impacts on the algal bloom, it's highly dependent on weather. 2015 was a record. 2016 was about a third of that. And then our current projections put this year's bloom at about 7.5 on average. And the bloom typically is just starting to increase at this time of year and then peaks later on in the summer. So we know the phosphorus is coming primarily from agriculture because of the timing of the loads. They spike during snowmelt and rain events in winter and early spring following fall application. Next slide. Ag retailers have valuable products and services which can keep phosphorus on cropland and out of waterways. Here's a list of some of those, along with some very rough average reductions in losses based on published studies. There's lots of variability in the published numbers based on soil type, slope, proximity to surface water, and other factors, but these rough averages give us a sense of where we can likely make a difference. Cover crops, soil testing, grid or zone sampling, variable rate application, custom application are all revenue generating opportunities for ag retailers that also reduce phosphorus losses. Ag retailers can also let farmers know when a broadcast application is being made so the farmer can get out there and get the application covered, avoiding the application before a heavy rain event, abiding by setbacks from surface water, and letting farmers know when you see an issue out in the field that needs an attention, like a blown tile drain. Applying only enough phosphorus to the following crop rather than the next several crops in the rotation can also make a difference. So today we'll hear from experts about strategies to manage cover crops, particularly about getting cover crops established effectively to retain nutrients and improve soil health without interfering with the primary cash crop. Next slide. So ag retailers are making a difference. For example, in our annual survey, we show large increases in variable rate phosphorus application here in the Sandusky River watershed, increasing from 17% of acres serviced in 2011 when we started the project to 70% last year. That's an incredible increase. In 2015, we secured funding for ag retailers to offer a discount on variable rate to farmers in several watersheds who had not used it before. And we've had nearly 40 ag retailers participate to date. So using those published estimates on the prior slide, the acres of VRT here alone represent more than 1 million pounds of phosphorus prevented from leaving cropland in the watershed. So we need to track and report these improvements that we're making so that regulators and the public are aware of these voluntary efforts, using the power of the marketplace to drive improvements. You'll hear more from Anna about some additional tools and resources we have for you to use as we all work together to achieve these goals. So with that, I'll turn the mic back to Anna.
Thanks, Tom. So as Tom mentioned, we do have some free resources available on our website, partnershipfarm.org. On the left, you can see the front page of our agronomist handbook that is available free for download. And on the right, you can see the front and back of our phosphorus loss reduction wallet cards, which can be ordered for free on our website as well. These serve as a great conversation starter with your growers, and many people order them to take to their various meetings. To date, we've distributed more than 25,000 wallet cards. So, our next webinar will be held towards the end of October, but the date and time are to be determined. And thanks to funding from the EPA Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we are now enrolling growers in the Sandusky, Cedar Portage, Lower Maumee, and Blanchard watersheds in Ohio for our latest VRT cost share program. If you are interested in learning more about VRT or possibly getting involved in the program, please contact Mark Adelsberger for more information. We also invite you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for PARM updates and industry news. After the webinar would be a perfect time to look us up from your computer or mobile device. So now we'll hear from Dr. Heidi Johnson, Dane County Crops and Soils Educator for the University of Wisconsin Extension, and Dan Smith, Outreach Specialist at University of Wisconsin-Madison.
All right, I think you can hear me now. And I'm gonna put my presentation up. There we go. Anna, can you just let me know if that all looks right?
Yep, looks good.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you for signing in today. As Anna mentioned, my name is Heidi Johnson. I'm the Crops and Soils Educator for Dane County Extension. I also work statewide with cover crops as a co-leader for our cover crop work group for Extension. So I work with Extension agents and Extension specialists across Wisconsin to conduct research and education about cover crops. I've also done a lot of work with other agency staff from NRCS and Land Conservation to try to collaborate on cover crop work and let each other know what we're doing about cover crops across the state. So I also manage a cover crop website for Wisconsin, and I'm gonna be showing that web address at the end. We try to keep that populated with our current research in cover crops and what our current recommendations are for cover crops. We use a web platform for that because our recommendations are always evolving, so it helps us to keep them up to date. So Dan Smith is also here with me, and we're going to be switching back and forth. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit, Dan?
Hi, I'm Dan Smith, Southwest Regional Specialist, Outreach Specialist for the University of Wisconsin Nutrient and Pest Management Program based in Madison, as well as UW Extension. I work primarily on nutrient management concerns in Southwest Wisconsin, helping growers implement nutrient management plans, implementing cover crops into those, as well as special pest management issues. I also help lead some work on cover crop interseeding, focusing on demonstration plots at Lancaster Agricultural Research Station to help farmers come out and experience what we're working on.
All right. So getting right into it, Dan and I never miss an opportunity to talk about how to pick the best cover crop. We're going to be focusing on cover crop timing, planting timing, and planting methods today. But I always think it's really important to help people pick the right cover crops. And number one on that list for how to pick the right cover crop is what is the farmer's goal. So if erosion management is the farmer's goal, you need to pick a cover crop that's actually going to be covering the soil at those critical times of the year when you need to prevent soil from moving off of a field. So if you're not having residue, so for example with tillage radish is a cover crop that was really popular early on, but we realized over time that it decomposes so quickly that it really lacks cover in those critical times of the year, which would be the early spring. And so we really need to combine tillage radish with something like a grass cover crop that will continue to cover the soil through the spring. So that's just an example of lining up a farmer's goal with a cover crop that's actually going to meet that goal. Other things that need to be considered is the rotation that you're using, the location that you're in. I always tell farmers that Wisconsin doesn't start with an I, because what works in Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois is not what works here in Wisconsin. We're just that much further north that it's a different system, and we need to take that into account when we select a cover crop. And then really what Dan and I are going to be focusing on today is that cover crop timing and picking a cover crop that works with when you can get it planted, and then the equipment available to you either as a farmer or what they can get custom done is going to be critical in picking which cover crop they're going to use. So getting right into the seeding methods and timing, Dan and I have divided this up into the time of the year that you're going to get it planted, and then we'll talk about what the various options are at that time of the year. First, I'm going to start off with the seeding methods that are your options for post-harvest. And this is just the typical timing for cover crop planting is going to be after you get your cash crop off. So there's two kind of methods for planting. You can get the seed on top of the ground, or you can get the seed in the ground. Some of the equipment options, there's going to be a spinner spreader or an airflow seeder. Something like that is going to put the cover crop seed on top of the ground. The pros for that type of planting method is you're going to be able to plant a lot more acres more quickly because you're not putting anything into the soil, so you can move faster. The cons are anytime you put a seed on top of the soil and just leave it there, you're going to have poor seed to soil contact. That means you're going to it's going to be critical for you to get rain to get germination on the cover crop. And generally you're going to have a slower growing or slower to get growing, I should say, cover crop, because it's going to take it longer to get established, and you're generally not going to put on as much growth as if you had put the seed into the ground. You're also leaving that seed vulnerable to predation, and I'm going to talk about predation a little bit and the biggest problems we're having with seed predation with cover crops. The other option for putting the seed in the ground is a drill. Obviously, that's the tried and true method. There's also lots of experimentation going on with broadcasting a seed, either with an airflow seeder or some other type of broadcast equipment, and then going over it with a tillage pass to incorporate the seed into the ground. Obviously, the pros, especially with a drill, is you're going to get better seed to soil contact, and you're going to put the cover crop seed in a layer of the soil that generally will have a little bit more moisture. So you have a better chance of getting that seed up and out of the ground quicker. So you're going to get more growth on it. It's going to be faster to get up and growing. You're going to get a more consistent stand, and hopefully you're going to get a little bit more growth in the short amount of time you have left there at the end of the season. The cons are it's going to be a little bit slower going because the equipment is putting the seed into the ground. You're not going to be able to cover as many acres as quickly. And then you're going to need the equipment. You're either going to need a drill, or you're going to need the broadcast seeder with a vertical till or something that you're going to use to incorporate the seed. So these are just, I'm going to show you a series of pictures from some work that I've done with cover crops comparing different seeding methods. And this was some plots that we did in Dane County, and we were comparing cover crops that had been drilled versus broadcast with a vertical tillage pass. So this is the cover crop that was drilled in, and this picture is taken from directly above it, just so you can get an idea of the amount of soil that's getting covered with the cover crop. This is barley, and it's about 12 inches tall. So this is in comparison to the next one. This was planted with the airflow seeder. So the seed was just broadcast over the soil surface, and you could see just a little bit less growth on that because we didn't get as much soil to seed contact, so it takes a little bit longer for it to germinate, or it needs to wait for a rain, so just a little shorter and a little less coverage. And then the air seeder with a vertical tillage pass, that we actually had a lot more problems with that one during these plots because the vertical tiller was set a little too deep, and so we got a lot of seed buried too deep, and we got uneven coverage with the air seeder. So just a comparison, and I can go back through them so that you can see them one more time, the difference between them. It's pretty striking, the difference in growth between the drilled one and the airflow seeded, and the airflow seeded with the vertical tillage pass. So a different trial that we did just this past year, this was seeded with an airflow seeder again, and it was seeded on September 12th. This was put into seed corn. So the seed corn came off on September 6th, and then we went across it with the airflow seeder on the 12th. and this picture was taken on November 1st. And this is barley again. So quite a bit different from the other trial that he had. We had a lot more consistent stand with this one, and it went in a little bit earlier, so we got a little bit more growth on it. This is compared to the drilled plots. This, if you'll notice the difference in the planting date, so the airflow seeder was done on September 12th, and the drill didn't get done until September 19th. The goal had been to plant those on the exact same day, but we had a little bit of trouble, again, an equipment issue where the farmer didn't have a drill, and so we had to find somebody to do it, to custom do it with the drill, and it was difficult to find someone to do that. So it is a week difference in the planting date. The pictures were both taken on November 1st, so you can see the difference. This is probably about the end of the growing season for us, so we're not going to get much more growth on that. I'm sorry, I said this was barley. This is actually oats, so I apologize for that. And this is oats actually mixed with a little bit of rye. This was 1.25 bushels of oats mixed with 20 pounds of rye. And you can't really see the rye because the rye is a lot smaller at this time of the year, but then it came through the next year. So for planting timing post-harvest, I can't stress how important it is to just really get the cover crop planted as soon as possible, particularly if you're going to do a broadcast seeding. It really needs to go out as soon as possible. Those growing degree days in the fall, especially in Wisconsin, they just dwindle so rapidly, and it's difficult to get growth the later you go. And so I've got a few more plot pictures here to show you from another trial that I did in Dane County that just shows you the difference between growth and the planting date. So this is rye and barley, and this was all planted on September 10th. And you can see these pictures again are taken from up above so that you can see how much of the ground is covered by the cover crop. But this barley is probably about 14 inches tall. The rye is more like 6 inches tall because it's just lower growing in the fall, but we got a good amount of growth on this. This is September 23rd. So if we go back, that one was September 10th, and then we go forward, this is just 13 days later. And this picture was taken November, the same day as the other one. And you can see such a big difference in growth between those two planting dates. And then you add on 10 more days and you get about half the amount of growth again, just from that extra 10 days of waiting to get the cover crop planted. And if you go all the way out to October 10th, you can see a huge difference in the amount of cover crop growth. So I'll go back to the beginning again, just so you can appreciate them all in succession. September 10th, September 23rd, September 30th, and then October 10th. And this October 10th, this picture was taken in November, and this is about what we ended up with for growth on it. So you don't get much growth the later you go. So we stress to farmers how important it is in our region to get that cover crop in as early as possible. So one other thing to think about, I also, for the same trial that I just showed you the pictures of where I did the different planting dates, I did some soil nitrate testing. And this shows you a huge difference in the amount of soil or the amount of nitrogen that's taken up by the cover crops depending on when they got planted. So there was only about 40 pounds, 45 pounds of nitrogen left in the soil with those early planted cover crops. So we can maybe make the assumption there that all the rest of the nitrogen is getting taken up by those plants. And the later you get for planting, all the way out to the October 10th date, you can see how much nitrogen is left in the soil. So these cover crops can also act like a sponge for us and be sucking up excess nitrogen in the fall, but we have to get them early enough so that they can do that job. So pre-harvest cover crop planting methods. If you want to get the cover crop on really early because of this problem we have with lack of time after we get our cash crop harvested, there's lots of work going on looking at how we get cover crops in while the crop is still out there. So for planting a cover crop late season while your cash crop is still out there, there's only a couple of options. The airplane is probably the most common option for getting cover crops out there. I put the highboy in parentheses because we just don't have a lot of people doing that. There's a lot more risk for damaging your cash crop trying to run through with a highboy. There is some of it going on, especially in seed corn, but it's just a lot less popular than the airplane. So what I really see as pros for, the biggest pro for using something like, particularly like an airplane, is we're going to save farmer time in the fall. And that it means a lot, especially when harvest comes around and there's so many other things to do for the farmer. So the airplane gives us an option for getting something custom done that can save the farmer's time. It's also sort of weather independent. Obviously, the airplane can't fly in every weather condition, but they're not as dependent on soil conditions for getting through there because they don't touch the soil. So cons, there are some cons for sure with airplane seeding, and I'll go over some of that, but you really do need to have timely cash crop harvest. You need rain because the cover crop seed is going to be on the soil surface again, and so it needs rain to really get up and going. And then again, vulnerable to seed predators, and I will go over that a little bit. Early season cover crop planting, this is the part that Dan is going to discuss, so I'm not going to get into that. We're going to switch over to his slides when we get to that part. So for aerial seeding, this is the area that I've been doing a lot of work in the last year or two, trying to get some systems that work with the airplane. The seed species, the cover crop seed species that we see are pretty successful in silage or seed corn or vegetables are really barley, cereal rye, oats, and wheat. And when you get into corn for grain or soybeans, really cereal rye is the only option just because of the time of year in Wisconsin. We don't have a lot of other cover crops that can survive at those temperatures. So I highlighted barley and cereal rye for the first bullet, the silage, seed corn, or vegetables, and that's because those would really be my recommendation for farmers. If a farmer doesn't want a cover crop that survives the winter, they want it to winter kill in Wisconsin, barley is my favorite cover crop right now for that. And if they want a cover crop that will survive the winter and keep growing in the spring, then cereal rye is the best option. Oats and wheat will work, but just not as consistent results with those two as I find with barley and cereal rye. Seeds, cover crop seeds that we've had limited success just because there's not that much time left of the season typically when we're planting them is the small seeded legumes like the clovers, especially going in after silage corn or especially corn or soybeans. We just don't have enough of a season for clovers to nodulate and grow and produce nitrogen, which is what we would really want for spending the money on a clover. Also, the brassicas really just don't work because of lack of time at this point in the season. So radishes and turnips are really popular as cover crops, and I think they work great after winter wheat. But really after silage corn or soybeans, it's just not really great options at that time of the year. Seed species that just don't work with an airplane would be the large seeded legumes like peas or soybeans. They just don't get enough soil to seed contact to be effective when they're thrown onto the soil surface like that. So timing for aerial seeding is really critical. Sunlight is a really important issue, and Dan's going to talk a lot about sunlight because especially the system he's talking about when you're putting cover crops in the early season, sunlight is going to be a major factor for the cash crop competing with your cover crop. So at the end of the year, when you're putting cover crops, seeding cover crops into standing crops, if you're doing silage corn or vegetables, we generally recommend that you don't plant that cover crop more than 14 days prior to harvest. What we find is that you get a lot of top growth on your cover crop because it's stretching to get light, and it just starts to peter out after that 14 days. So it's best to try to get planned so that you know that that silage, seed corn, or vegetables are going to get harvested in a timely manner. Grain corn, generally recommend when the corn plant has dried up to the ear. We start to get enough sunlight penetration then where it can work to put the cover crops in. And with soybeans, you want to go in when they're just starting to turn yellow. And I've got some pictures of what that looks like. I do need to give credit here to Damon Raby. He's a pilot that works out of Waupun, and a lot of these pictures are his, so I'll give him credit here. He's done a lot of work with seeding cover crops with the airplane. So this is a picture of kind of the correct timing in soybeans. Of course, we always get uneven color change in soybeans, so you just kind of have to pick when most of the field is starting to turn yellow. That seems to work the best. For corn, this is a picture of when they've gone, when it's dried out up to the ear, when the leaves have turned brown up to the ear. That would be the time of the year you'd want to seed in corn. And then in silage corn, as I mentioned, you want to do it no more than 14 weeks prior to harvest. And this is some pictures from Dane again showing an example of that. So this is 2 bushels of spring barley that was flown on September 6th into silage corn. And the picture on the left was taken on 9/25. So that's about, what is that, 19 days after, so a little bit late even. And then if you go 21 days after, which is the photo on the right, you start to see the cover crop is starting to fall over. And this is pretty consistently what we see happen. The cover crop reaches, and then it just runs out of energy. The other problem is the cover crop's putting all of its energy into top growth, so you have very shallow root systems. So if it starts to get dry at this point, the cover crop pretty quickly can run out of moisture and just dry out in the canopy, and then you lose it. So it is important to make sure that you get the timing right and you know when your silage is going to be coming off. So this photo was taken, I believe that, no, this isn't the same plots as the last picture. This is a different one, but this photo was taken at the end of October, and these cover crops were seeded in early September. And then the silage on the left came off on September 18th, and the silage on the right came off on September 28th. And you can see a big difference in the amount of cover crop left there. So it becomes a real struggle for it to survive in the canopy. This is a trial that I had this past year. I showed you some pictures already of the drilled and the airflow seeded plots. We also had an airplane seeded plots, and this was in seed corn. The airplane seeded it into the cover crop into the seed corn on August 17th. And then the harvest, the seed corn was picked on September 6th. And this picture was taken in November. And this, again, was that 1.25 bushels of oats mixed with 20 pounds of rye. And you can see the oats got about 3 feet here. So really got lots of growth. I was actually pretty concerned when we did this, because when they picked the sweet corn, the cover crop looked pretty miserable. It didn't look very good, but I was shocked at how much it filled in. So there was lots of open spaces around that harvest time, but the cover crop really filled in after that, and we ended up with a really nice stand. The only problem that we had with this was in these strips where we did it with the airplane, the rye actually died out underneath the oats. Pretty much totally, because it was starved for sunlight down there. In the drilled and the airflow seeded plots, the rye survived at a much higher rate in those plots, so we had a lot more spring cover. So, but the upside of it is that we had plenty of oat residue there. So you make up for it with oat residue, which I'm going to talk a little bit about some issues that we've had with rye cover crops going into the cash crop, the next cash crop. And so it might actually be preferable to a farmer to have oat residue rather than that live rye cover crop in the spring. So what are the issues with aerial seeding? If you pick the correct seed and you get it in at the right time, what else could go wrong? Well, these little guys are a huge problem. And this is what I was talking about a couple of times already about seed predators. These are slugs. We have 2 different kinds of slugs in Wisconsin, and I see pretty much when I see one, I see the other one. They're generally present together in fields, and they love cover crops. So this is them eating some rye, and what they do is run through and eat the germ end off of all the rye. So if you actually don't go into the field and pick up a rye seed and look at the germ end, you won't notice that it's missing, because it's just a little hole in the end of it. It looks like the seed is still there. So we've had farmers that have gotten aerial seeding done, and then they've gotten upset because they think that either the pilot didn't put the seed out or something happened, and in actuality, slugs went through and just ate the germ ends off of all of their seeds, and that's why they didn't get any germination on their cover crop. So what's the remedy for this? Generally, we recommend that farmers check to see if their field has slugs before they plant a cover crop by broadcast seeding. And a quick and easy way to do that is to go put boards out in the field and then go back and check those boards the next day. And by board, I just mean a piece of plywood that you just stick out there. Go back the next day and the slugs should be hiding underneath it if you have them present in the field. This is generally a good method. I have tried this method in fields though and not gotten any slugs, but still had some slug damage. So it's not a foolproof method. You probably want to put boards out in several areas of the field too to make sure that you've accounted for any spatial variation in their populations. If you do have slugs, then you probably just want to stay away from rye. Slugs have a lot harder time eating barley because of the husk on it, so that's an option. They will eat barley given enough time, so if you can broadcast seed ahead of a rain and you know that cover crop is going to germinate quickly, then it might germinate before the slugs have enough time to start eating it. The other issue that can happen with aerial seeding is this is a picture of grain corn, and if you get your grain corn harvested particularly late, all that residue from the corn can start to smother out the cover crops. So this picture that you're looking at here was 30 pounds of cereal rye. It was flown into grain corn on September 10th, and then there was an insurance check strip left that wasn't harvested until November 14th, while the rest of the field had been harvested on October 6th. And what we believe happens here is that the residue covers up the cover crop at the time of harvest. The stuff that got harvested on October 6th had enough growing degrees left in the season to grow back through that grain, the residue from the grain corn. Where it got harvested late, there just wasn't enough growing degrees left in the system, and that ended up smothering out the rye there. So just again, timely crop harvest is important all around. One more thing I'll mention too is it just generally seems to work better in lower yielding fields or smaller statured corn. Anything that can be anywhere where you have more sunlight is going to be favorable for using cover crops, putting cover crops on with an airplane. So now we're going to be switching to Dan's presentation, and just bear with us for a minute while we make the switch of presentations. Okay. All right.
Thanks, Heidi. So we're going to jump right into early season seeding options. In-season applications of cover crops. Typically, we're thinking about V4 through maybe V6, V8 growth stage in corn, and we'll talk about soybeans in a little bit. So we're thinking about broadcast applications of cover crops as just a simple 3-point broadcast spreader on a tractor, maybe applying these cover crops at our nitrogen side dress pass or a herbicide application, potentially using some specialized equipment, commercially made, maybe modifying some equipment on farm that we already have. And then soybeans, we're really thinking after some of the research and farmers we've talked to that soybeans may not be a great fit for an in-season application of cover crops. Broadcast seeding, we've seen some guys out doing this season. And this summer near Dodgeville, Wisconsin, into V8 corn, we interseeded 12 pounds of red clover. It germinated in about 4 days. We did get timely rains. We got about an inch of rain the night that we seeded, and we think that definitely added to our success. In previous years, we've seen oats seeded into corn via a high clearance sprayer. About the same time, a little bit later in summer, about 2 bushels per acre seeding rate and some success. But again, sunlight and water availability are going to be really key to these systems. Applying the cover crop with the nitrogen side dress pass or maybe the last herbicide pass across the field is a really common question that I get. This is farmers looking to save a pass across the field. Maybe this is going to be done with an airflow type system where they're going to blend the cover crop seed with the fertilizer seed. There's some concerns with maybe the seed being burned by the herbicide or the fertilizer application. We've had a lot of farmer testimonials that say they have had some success. blending their cover crop seed, but again, remember to start small if you're going to try anything like this. Liquid versus dry nitrogen applications, we feel that there's probably more potential to have a burn on the seed with a liquid nitrogen application. Again, there's some farmers that are trying this in Southwest Wisconsin with some limited success. A dry N application, there's some farmer experimentation where they're blending the seed with the red clover at sort of the fertilizer blending process. Applying this seed in a broadcast application really needs to be followed by a rainfall event. Applying the cover crop at side dress timing for corn using a side dress bar and an air seeder or broadcast seeder on the back of that piece of equipment may have some success, but we've also had some cases where we've seen such as red clover being burned by that fertilizer. So maybe injecting the fertilizer may be an advantage at that timing. There we go. So we've seen a lot of specialized equipment come into the state or the upper Midwest in the last couple of years. I went to National Farm Machinery Show this year, and for the first time that I've been going for the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of cover crop equipment, a lot of commercially made equipment that's marketed for interseeding specifically. It's exciting to see. It's exciting to see farmers investing in the technology to get the cover crop out there at that earlier timing, maybe a little bit less busy season. Of course, there's the Penn State Interseeder. We've seen success with that machine in Wisconsin with farmers using that type of machine, and again, an investment that farmers have chosen to make. We've tried soybeans in our system with broadcast and drill approaches, and it really seems like even in 30-inch row soybeans, we get too much canopy shading for any cover crop to survive. The pictures here illustrate the interseeding pass using the modified no-till drill that we used in our experiments. With radish, for instance, the radish survived up until late summer last year. And then once the soybeans completely canopied, the radishes didn't take long to die out. And as the next picture shows on the far right, the mature soybeans, that's an alleyway that I'm standing in that we cut through to do some data measurements, and the radish is thriving in the alleyway. However, it's not existent in the soybean rows. So this is where we come to using a modified no-till drill. And this research is kind of a collaboration of research efforts in the state. Just this year, there's some counties doing more experimentation using modified equipment. In the past, we've had Dr. Francisco Arriaga, Mark Rins, Vince Davis, and Matt Ruark have all had a very strong interest in this project, and that research is continuing on in the Dr. Matt Ruark program. We're really interested in the drill because we get good seed to soil contact. We're using a modified no-till drill rather than one of the commercially available units because we already had the equipment, much like many farmers in Wisconsin already have a no-till drill to establish alfalfa and wheat. It's a fairly simple modification process that takes, depending on the drill size, 1 to 4 hours we've found every time we've done it. There are obviously very strong disadvantages to using the no-till drill. We find that the no-till drill can be slow to use. Obviously, you still have to figure in that time to modify the equipment. It's really important to match the drill size versus the corn planter size. The picture on the very bottom of the screen shows the corn touching the end wheel on the drill. We did knock down some corn when our planter passes didn't line up nearly exact. So if you have some curvy winding fields like are common in Southwest Wisconsin, a 3-point drill is definitely going to be more favorable than an end wheel drill. The end wheel drill seemed like it worked well as long as the rows were straight and you took your time with that piece of equipment. The broadcast seeding application is definitely an advantage in those windy, curvy fields, the contour fields, because it's obviously it doesn't matter how straight the corn rows are and the contours of the land. So when we modify our drill, we take off 4 row units off our drill, and we have no-till coulters in the very front of the drill that we remove as well that are separate from the row units. Some of the newer drills all come off in one piece, and you just have to unbolt 4 bolts and take off the 2 hoses. So we're looking at a 7.5-inch spacing on our drill that gives us 15 inches between the row units for the corn to pass through. Never had a problem with the modified drill damaging corn within those rows. It's plenty of room for the corn to go through. And again, we're thinking that V4 through V6 timing for this system. We're traveling roughly 3 to 4 miles an hour with this drill, so we're taking our time and making sure that we do a good job to not knock down any corn. Larger equipment, that could be a concern as well. Another drill we modified just this year was a newer drill. Again, the same type of setup, very quick and easy to modify. This new drill had 4 bolts on each row unit that we had to remove, and it was about an hour-long process. Again, we took it out to the field to try it out, and it worked great. And we planted some demonstration plots that look excellent this year as well down at the Lancaster Research Station. So when we think about interseeding, the species selection is going to be really important. As Heidi talked about, you really have to have a goal for your cover crop and what you want to get out of it. Residual herbicides are going to be a main consideration when you're picking your species, and it may make interseeding impractical the first year trying it if you don't plan those residual herbicides. We've seen several cases where farmers have applied residual herbicides and then tried to interseed cover crops, and it's the herbicide's done its job and taken out any weeds that grow in that system, and that would be the cover crop, unfortunately. So pick those residual herbicides wisely. Think about grass versus broadleaf herbicides and what kind of cover crop you're going to establish, the half-life of those herbicides, how long is that herbicide going to stick around for. The weather is going to be very important those particular years as far as how long the residual herbicide lasts when we think about rainfall and soil and air temperature. We found for our species that we like to select, red clover has been a great performer the last couple of years in our trials. We've seen red clover perform well in years where it's been wet and the corn has been very aggressive, when we've also seen red clover perform well in our typically normal year per se. Winter rye, we've seen really good results 2 out of 3 years in our trials. The third year, just this last year, we saw winter rye get very competitive with the corn. It was a very wet and very warm early spring and early summer for us when we planted the winter rye, and that winter rye really competed strongly with the corn. It's also important to point out that we've never seen a significant yield decrease or increase with red clover, where we have seen that with winter rye in 1 year. Annual ryegrass is not up here. We've been very hesitant to use annual ryegrass in our studies for its ability to quickly become a spring weed. Wisconsin springs are very cool, and it's sometimes hard to terminate our cover crops. So we have tried that for the first time this year, and look for that data later to come in next year's report. When we think about the species that we've tried and not been real successful with, the first thing that we often get questioned on is, well, did you have a residual herbicide out there? Our studies, we control our weeds with glyphosate alone, which is not a good practice for resistant weed management, but we're really focused on just establishing our cover crops, and we can manage our weeds in our plots other ways. Raceme clover and crimson clover, we've tried. They germinate well, however, they do not endure that shade of the corn very well in our trials we've seen. The oats and peas mixtures we've tried as well. 1 year we've had the oats and peas survive until corn harvest, however, we got very little biomass out of them, and we would consider that a failure as well. Radish we've seen establish really well and grow until the end of the season. However, there's very little below ground biomass associated with that radish. The radish tuber is probably about the diameter of a pencil or smaller in the fall, and it's quickly broken down after we get our first frost. So we consider that a potential failure. Again, if you're looking just to get something out there to cover the soil during the corn growing season, radish does grow in that climate, but it's really not going to do a whole lot as far as our below ground biomass establishment goes. Typical seeding rates, we may be a little bit higher than what some of the farmers are using in our state as far as seeding rates go, but these are taken from the Midwest Cover Crop Council recommendations, and these is what we started with, so that's what we're going to continue trying in our trials. Again, seeding rate is often discussed among farmers about how low can we go to get a cover crop out there established for economic wise, so it's something to consider when you're planning your cover crop. These are some of our pictures when we're out establishing our cover crop at the V5 growth stage in corn. Again, the drill easily goes through the corn rows without damaging the corn. You may get the corn to bend a little bit on the front end of the frame of the drill, depending on how low that is, but it will spring right back up, and we've never seen that as being an issue. We really like the good seed to soil contact that we've been getting in the no-till system. The photo on the left is in a conventional tilled field, and the photo on the right is in a no-till field using a no-till drill. So we've done our research at Arlington and Lancaster Agricultural Research Station, so we're kind of in the south central part of the state and the southwest part of the state. We've always done randomized complete block trials with 4 replications at Arlington and 3 replications at Lancaster. And these studies started in 2014. These cover crops were seeded again in early July in 2014 because we had a late corn planting date, but we had really good establishment of the oats and peas in the upper left-hand corner. The next photo is our red clover. Bottom photo on the left is the radish, and then on the right is the winter rye. And we really like to see very little biomass accumulation throughout the corn growing season. That means the cover crops focusing on a little bit of more root development and is not trying to compete with the corn. We want it to just hang out underneath the corn canopy and then quickly take off once we take the corn off. At fall, you can see the great biomass above ground that we got on the radish and the red clover. Again, we had a lot of biomass accumulation on the red clover. Once we harvest these plots, though, you really can't tell they're even out there. The corn residue really puts a nice blanket over the cover crops, and it's tough to say that we actually did anything out there unless you actually go out and dig through the residue. However, when you do go out the next spring, if the winter rye makes it through the system, you get a really nice stand of winter rye in early May. An ideal field to go out and plant soybeans into. Either wait and crimp them later on at that full enthesis stage, or go ahead and use a herbicide and spray them off and no-till plant the soybeans right into. A lot of Wisconsin growers are also interested in using this as potential forage the next spring, but be mindful of your residual herbicides and rotational plant back restrictions on those herbicides if you're thinking about doing that. Again, 2015, we like to see that nice low growing plant out there in the field, the winter rye, radish, and red clover. Not a lot of biomass out in the field during the summer. The oats pea mixture in 2015 didn't consistently germinate. We think that's due to excessive shading we saw in 2015. Again, very weather dependent system. But we're really happy about the 3 species that we did get to go in 2015. And then at harvest, we had a really nice stand of winter rye, radish, and red clover. The red clover and winter rye both performed well, we've thought, in this system in this particular year, and the red clover looked particularly well the next spring. We look at our corn grain yield. We haven't seen any statistically significant difference in the corn grain yield in 2014 and 2015 among any of the cover crops. And if you look at the data, you'll see quite a bit of variability between the corn grain yields, and that's the nature of this system is we did see a lot of variability in both the corn grain yield and the biomass of the cover crops. However, it was not enough to statistically separate the cover crop species when it came to corn grain yield. However, in 2016, we did see winter rye and radish both statistically decrease corn grain yield with respective yields of 249 in the Czech, 234 bushels per acre for the radish, and 224 bushels per acre for the winter rye. 240 for the red clover, and then 242 for the oats pea mixture, but the oat pea mixture did not survive until corn grain yield harvest. So we're really looking at just that red clover as being kind of the winner among all the cover crops over the last 3 years. We look at biomass, dry weights at harvest, pounds per acre. Again, really variable data. We're not seeing a lot of biomass accumulated out there in the field, but we do have our cover crop established going into winter to protect the soil, prevent some soil erosion from occurring, and then hopefully that cover crop will take off in early spring. And as you can see, the oats pea mixture really did not perform very well at all in the system, really low biomass numbers. We look at Lancaster corn grain yield. Again, a very similar story, no significant difference in any of the corn grain yields. The bold text indicates the cover crops actually survived until harvest. Red clover and radish, again, survived until harvest. The red clover looked really good the next spring, as I'll show in the next couple pictures. This last year, we had a really tough time with winter rye again. At Lancaster, it took off early, tried to outcompete the corn, and eventually died back. At least it did not statistically impact our corn grain yield, but from a visual standpoint, it did affect the corn stand out in the field. 2016, pictures from our red clover plots pre-harvest. We had really nice biomass and cover out in the field. 1 month following harvest, if you remember 2016, we had a pretty warm into fall time period. We got that red clover to actually come up through the biomass of the corn, and then in spring of 2017, we had a nice stand of red clover to go out and plant into again. Again, we terminated these cover crops for ideal planting date for probably soybeans instead of corn. When we're thinking about any potential nitrogen credit that these cover crops may have, we're assessing that data right now and looking into if we do potentially have a red clover nitrogen credit out there in the field. We look at silage corn. Silage corn, we tried for the first time last year. Looks really good potential for red clover again. The picture on the left is from the end of September. These were chopped with a commercial silage chopper, a very large machine with semis going through the field to collect the harvest from that machine. So a lot of compaction, a lot of weight. We had a rather wet time at silage harvest this last year. The red clover was definitely set back by that. You can see the wheel traffic and how compacted it was. But on the following spring, this spring in 2017, you can see that our red clover bounced back, grew through that wheel traffic, and looked really nice the next spring. So this is maybe something to consider in a continuous silage system. Get the cover crop out there, get the cover crop established early on, cut the silage corn off, and then let that cover crop grow. We saw a lot of fall growth out of the red clover as well this year. So if you're going to try interseeding, start small. That's going to be the biggest advice. Make sure that you understand the system you're planting it into. Have a plan for future crop rotations that are going to work with the cover crops that you're selecting. Select residual herbicides wisely. We have done the cover crop interseeding in an organic setting for the last 2 years now. Last year we tried it up by Cashton, Wisconsin with limited success. This year we tried it at the Arlington Agricultural Research Station, and the cover crops are looking good so far. Again, red clover is the clear winner. Be mindful if you're going to do a lot of cultivation though in those fields, how the drill is driven. We have a drill that we use that's ground driven, and it struggles, ground driven with a coulter, and it struggles to cut through and get any traction in those heavily cultivated fields. So maybe consider that before you try it in a heavy cultivated field. Red clover has been the clear winner in our trials. Annual ryegrass, we're just trying for the first time this year. There's other research that supports annual ryegrass may be a decent fit as well. Remember that our trials were established under ideal soil and environmental conditions. We're getting timely rains and correct growing degree days in this system is going to be very critical for success. We have a new video out there showing the modification of the drill. The Nutrient Pest Management Program has a whole series of videos on cover crops and on pest management and nutrient management issues that are a great resource. We have a cover crop interseeding no-till drill modification video that just came out this year, as well as a video that Dr. Matt Ruark and I did several years ago on the no-till interseeding system as well, that has gotten a lot of success out there. So that ends my presentation. I welcome any questions that you guys have through email or phone if you guys do not want to ask them today. Otherwise, I guess we'll take questions.
Well, no, there's a couple more. Sorry, I added a couple more things, so I'll do this really quickly. I see we're out of time. But the only other thing I wanted to bring up was spring seeding. This is something that we're just looking a little bit more into just this past year, really. This cover crop is rye that was seeded with an airplane into on about March 28th. And we were looking to see, because the rye has to vernalize to go to flower, we were hoping that it would just hang out and stay small, and we could kill it just prior to planting. For some reason, after he seeded it in late March, we must have got cold enough nights that it did vernalize, and so we ended up with some headed out rye. which has caused some issues. But I think this is maybe a system that may be useful for us, especially here in Wisconsin with such a limited amount of fall. If you don't get your cover crop out in the fall, it might be possible to do it in the spring. And the rates you can get for planting with an airplane in the spring when the pilots have nothing else to do is pretty favorable. So it's something we're looking into. Of course, there's always frost seeding cover crops into winter wheat, and this is done in the spring. This has been looked at extensively in Wisconsin, and we already have an extension publication on it. So if you're interested in that system, they get a pretty nice nitrogen credit out of that then going into corn the next year. So they've played with it quite a bit. It works pretty well on most years, and so it's a system you can read more about. I'm not going to get into this because I think we're going to run out of time, but I did want to touch a little bit on some issues that we've seen with rye in Wisconsin, and this shows you plots that are side by side where rye had been used as a cover crop that was killed the day before the corn was planted versus the picture on the right, there was no rye there. And we've seen a lot of stunting in corn following rye as a cover crop, so I like to make people aware of that. It just may have more to do with timing your kill of the rye, so it's a little bit earlier. I have some recommendations here. They're mostly from research that came out of Iowa by USDA. Basically just making sure you get your rye killed early, making sure you have a good planter set up and that you're planting under the right conditions. And probably pretty importantly also is making sure you're putting on some nitrogen at planting. We see maybe about 40 pounds less of nitrogen at planting time in plots that have had rye in it, just because of the tie-up of nitrogen as the rye is decomposing. I won't get into the allelopathy issue. It's something that gets talked about a lot. All I will say is that I don't think allelopathy is the problem every year or ever. It may just happen very, very periodically, but rye does have the potential to impact a cash crop from allelopathy to under perfect conditions. So I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to leave that, and we're going to go to the end. So questions, we do have a cover crop website that I mentioned, and if you just Google Wisconsin cover crops, you'll find it. We're also going to have a cover crop conference in Wisconsin this year on February 27th. In Stevens Point. If you go to the cover crop website, you will see the announcement for the conference. And with that, I will wrap up, and I apologize, it's 11 already.
That's fine. Let me switch back to me. Okay, well, thank you, Heidi and Dan, for providing the valuable information that you've shared with us today. So we still have 10 minutes for Q&A. So the audience members, you should enter your questions into the question box on your screen. And a few of you have, so I'll just get started with that. So this could go to either presenter. So what portions of the Great Lakes Basin have similar conditions? Oh, sorry, there's a bit of noise.
Hello, please enter your 6-digit conference code.
Oops. Okay, sorry, I'll start that again. So what portions of the Great Lakes Basin have similar conditions where Wisconsin recommendations would apply? And how would you adapt the recommendations further south and north?
Well, that's probably a really long answer. I mean, basically, we're limited by growing degree days and temperatures at the end of the year. So anywhere south of us, as I mentioned, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, though that kind of, that much more south of us is going to have probably a couple week extra time period. Even in the dairy regions in New York and Pennsylvania, I've had my dairy farmers have talked to dairy farmers out there that are doing cover crops, and even they might just get that extra week or 2 weeks of weather that really gives a lot more options for cover crops. You can get a lot more growth on your cover crops. You might be able to use a lot more diversity in species. I had mentioned that brassicas and legumes are probably not not really possible for us after silage corn in Wisconsin or any later. And, you know, that might be more possible south of us or out closer to the ocean where you get a little bit more growing degree days. So I think the possibilities are much better, particularly for post-harvest planting of cover crops. In Dan's situation, maybe it's, you know, when he's talking about interseeding, you're still going to have the shade, and those issues are still going to be the same. It's really just adding those end caps onto your growing season that are helpful.
Okay. I think this next question is for Dan. So would a co-application of liquid manure be more or less likely to burn seed?
That's a really innovative question, and that's some of the things that farmers are always thinking about, trying to get two things done at once and saving that past and saving that time and making cover crops work maybe more economically. I think that if you're going to think about putting the cover crops on with a manure side dress pass, I would recommend putting the cover crop on top of the ground rather than trying to mix it with the manure, and then start small, obviously. You could try it where you're going to put manure on top of the cover crop seed. However, think about the growing conditions that time of year. It may be too less advantageous to do it that way rather than just putting the cover crop on top of the manure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we have a question. It says, all of the sites show a yield loss using multiple varieties of cover crops. Between these yield losses and the cost of planting the cover, do you see objections due to these losses or expenses?
Right, so when we look at the yield data for the interseeding trials, there's a lot of variability in that data. So when we think about doing our trials, we look at the statistical significance. That way we can share it with other farmers in other regions. That they could expect similar results. Our data, when we think about the non-treated control compared to, say, red clover or winter rye, the variation in that could be up to 20 to 30 bushels per acre between the different plots. So when we're thinking about that system, that's why we do the statistics on the yields. That way we can make comparative statements between the two. But again, remember, a lot of variability what we saw in those corn yields, not necessarily due to interseeding cover crops.
Was that question just referring to the interseeding?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Because I mean, if just generally talking about yield loss with cover crops, I mean, I guess I would not say that you always see a yield loss with your cash crop. If that was true, I don't think anybody would be doing it. So, so there are issues with cover crops. I mean, you can definitely give yourself some management challenges with cover crops that can impact your cover crop or can impact your cash crop yield. That's why careful management is good. I usually tell farmers that have never done cover crops before, start simple. Take what you know works in your region, talk to Extension, talk to other farmers, see what you know works in your region, terminate early, make sure you do everything to help yourself have a good cash crop yield. And then as you get more years and experience under your belt, then start to experiment a little bit with things and see how things work. But I can't stress enough that you want to make sure you're conservative to start off until you figure things out, particularly getting your cash crop planted well. It is a different system, even going from no-till into planting into heavy cover crop residue. You're going to need to make some adjustments to your planter, and so you'll need to plan accordingly.
And remember that this is considered a system. In our studies, we typically do not follow cover crops because we like to tease out any differences that particular year. But in a system on an actual farm, you could definitely consider that systems-based approach, and you may see more advantages in the long run to incorporating these cover crops.
Okay. I'm not sure who this question is for, but is there an issue with the nitrogen leaching from the previous year cover, like clover and wheat?
Nitrogen leaching. Trying to figure out what that question means. Well, the red clover and wheat system, you're not going to be really losing nitrogen because that red clover is going to overwinter and you're going to be terminating it just prior to cash crop planting. So the way that we develop our nitrogen credits in Wisconsin is we actually do it based on the corn yield that follows it. And then, so we calculate it based on that, so you're not really seeing what is lost to the system, you're just seeing the credit you get. As far as nitrogen leaching out of systems though, I did show my data that showed lower nitrogen in the soil in the fall under a cover crop. And that is true, the cover crop's taking up nitrogen and holding it. The problem that we've been trying to overcome in Wisconsin is when does it come back out? And that's going to be different for different cover crops. Tillage radish, it was always stated early on that the cover crop of tillage radish was taking up to 100 pounds of nitrogen. We now have research in Wisconsin that says, yes, that's true, but we can't get any of it back into the following corn crop. It leaches out too early. That decomposed radish lets go of the nitrogen too early, and we lose it before the cash crop can start to take it up. We have the opposite problem with rye. It takes up a lot of nitrogen, but we just don't get it back in a timely manner that the next corn crop can use it, even when we take nitrogen samples all the way out until tasseling. So the synchronization of nitrogen is still a challenge with cover crops, and because it's weather, temperature, rain dependent, it's very difficult to research it, and it's very difficult to know what to expect from year to year.
Okay. So this will probably be the last question. So somebody asked, I'm still looking for a cost-benefit relationship to sell farmers on the concept of using cover crops. Do you know of any research that spells out cost benefits?
We pretty much talk about this every day in extension. This is putting cost to cover crops is a really challenging thing. So we have our hard costs those are easy to come up with. You got your planting costs, you got your seed costs, and if you get a nitrogen credit, then you know you're getting that benefit based on fertilizer costs. So that's an offset to the cover crop costs. Those are the hard costs. Those are easy. We could talk about that all day and bore people to death. But what people are really looking for is there a yield benefit? Is there a benefit to the soil that's going to either create long-term resilience in my agricultural system or something like that? And those are much more difficult to put numbers on. We know that cover crops reduce erosion by a certain amount. And if you want to put a fertilizer value on that soil that you're reserving or saving from loss to erosion, you could do that. Soil also holds on to water, so you've got increased water holding capacity. So over time, by not losing soil, you're saving yourself money, but it's not really money put into your pocket. It's just that you're not losing that money over time. So there's also the whole soil health aspect of it. Are you increasing your biological diversity in your soil, and is that helping your soil? And I think that's kind of the new frontier in research. The problem is that your soil type and your soil, all the characteristics of your soil are going to have a huge impact on all of these things. And we can't give some general recommendations or general information because it's not appropriate for everybody. So that's a challenging question. I think everybody, including Dan and I, that does cover crop research are thinking about this and trying to find a way to solve that problem, but it's a difficult nut to crack. We have in Wisconsin looked at how much you can increase organic matter over time. And generally what we found is if you are in a really bad place to start with, if your soil is in really rough shape, you can really add some organic matter to your soil over time in a relatively quick rate. You know, when I say quick, that's 10 years. You could probably make a good change in it over a 10-year time period. But if you've got pretty great soil, like Dan did research on at Arlington, which was a prairie in Wisconsin and beautiful deep soil, chances of you increasing organic matter over time are much less. So it really depends on what you start with for where you could possibly go.
We see great advantages in our short-term work in improving water infiltration using cover crops when you do side-by-side demonstrations. Even just several months after you planted a cover crop following wheat, following silage corn, you get much better water infiltration, much better water holding capacity potentially the next year. So you think about those short-term benefits, becoming more resilient in the system. Reducing soil erosion is a big concern, especially in our driftless region in the state, and trying to hold those soils in place to protect water quality is a main concern, as well as cover crops may open us up for a little wider window for manure applications on some farms as well. So we see it as many benefits, a little bit tougher to put it into the balance sheet, but again, those benefits in the long run may be a huge advantage economically.
Okay, great. Well, in the interest of time, I'd like to wrap up the Q&A. And I really want to thank Heidi and Dan for joining us today. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to share your work. So I guess at this time,
Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you. So at this time, I also want to recognize our participating ag retailers. If you are an ag retailer in the Great Lakes Basin, if you are a ag retailer in the Great Lakes Basin that is interested in participating in this partnership to benefit your business and water quality, please contact me. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge our funders and collaborators that made this webinar possible. In particular, the support of the Great Lakes Protection Fund and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So as we wrap up, please remember to look for the email later this afternoon with a webinar evaluation, webinar recording, and a link to submit your CCA credentials to earn the 1.5 CCA CEUs, if you have not already done so during registration. So I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope you join us again for our next webinar in October. Thank you.